The portrait never blinked, until the night the killer struck. Welcome to Vale Files. I am your host, Thorn. Let's connect, drop a comment, and share where you're tuning in from. You make every case more meaningful. Let's begin. It was on a grey and overcast Tuesday in late October that I, Dr. John H. Watson, found myself once again seated before the hearth at 221B Baker Street, leafing absent-mindedly through the Times, while my remarkable friend Sherlock Holmes stood at the window, his gaze fixed with peculiar intensity upon the street below. The steady drizzle had rendered the city a palette of washed-out greys, punctuated now and then by the dull gold of a hansom cab's lantern or the bright umbrella of a hurrying pedestrian. "You observe, Watson," Holmes said without turning, "that the gentleman in the charcoal frock-coat is contemplating whether or not to climb our steps. He has passed twice in the last 5 minutes and now hesitates beneath the gas lamp." I glanced up from my newspaper. "How on earth can you deduce that from behind the curtain?" "His reflection, my dear fellow," Holmes replied, drawing the curtain aside. "And now, he's resolved." Moments later, firm steps echoed on the stairs and a knock followed. Holmes called for the visitor to enter. The door opened, and in stepped a man of about 60, lean and angular, with a mane of silver hair and a manner both refined and slightly agitated. He carried under one arm a large object draped in cloth. "My name is Basil Fenwick," he said with a slight bow. "I come to you, Mr. Holmes, not for a murder or a theft, but for something stranger still, a presence that watches." Holmes motioned for him to take a seat. "Do continue, Mr. Fenwick." The gentleman placed the covered object on the table with something between reverence and apprehension. "I am the custodian of Marchmont Hall, a modest estate in Hertfordshire. My late cousin, Lady Evangeline Marchmont, died there this past summer, peacefully in her bed, or so the doctor claimed. Yet ever since, the household has been unsettled. Servants have left in a panic. My own valet swears to having heard whispers in the corridor at night, and, most bizarrely, guests complain of an uneasy feeling in the west drawing-room." "A haunted drawing-room, then?" I said, unable to hide a touch of scepticism. "Not quite, Dr. Watson. The room in question contains a large portrait of Lady Marchmont herself, painted in her youth, a fine piece rendered in oils by Sir Lawrence Montreux, but there is something about it, something unnatural." Holmes steepled his fingers, interest now kindled in his grey eyes. "Go on." Fenwick drew back the cloth, revealing the painting. Lady Marchmont's likeness stared out from the frame. A woman of fragile beauty and aloof poise, her dark eyes fixed forward. Yet something in them, some lifelike sharpness, sent a chill down my spine, though I could not at once articulate why. "I had it removed and stored away," Fenwick continued. "But even locked in the attic, strange events persisted. One maid claimed the eyes followed her. My valet says he caught a glint like glass beneath the painted surface. He's not a fanciful man." Holmes stood and approached the painting. "A portrait whose gaze disturbs the household." "I was told you would not dismiss me as mad," Fenwick added. Scotland Yard laughed it off. "Not mad, sir," Holmes murmured, now examining the canvas's edges. "Merely in possession of a puzzle, a silent witness, framed and watching." He stepped back. "Watson," he said, turning briskly, "we leave for Marchmont Hall this afternoon." And with that the game was afoot. The rain had settled into a persistent drizzle by the time Holmes and I arrived at Marchmont Hall that evening. The estate loomed ahead like a brooding spectre, its ivy-choked facade rendered ghostly by the rising mist that clung to the hedgerows and low stone walls. A footman met us at the carriage steps, his face pale and drawn, though he tried to maintain the expected decorum. We were ushered through a long, high-ceilinged hallway into a sitting room whose fire did little to warm the corners. Mr. Fenwick, now divested of his coat, stood before the hearth with a brandy in hand. "I cannot express my gratitude, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson. The household has been unsettled, to say the least. I hope you do not think me melodramatic." "I rarely deal in emotions, Mr. Fenwick," Holmes said, shedding his coat with a casual flick. "But I do deal in patterns, disturbances and anomalies. May we begin with the west drawing-room?" "Of course, though I warn you, the staff refused to enter it after dark." Fenwick lit a candelabrum and led us through a gallery lined with ancestral portraits, stern men in wigs and women in corseted grandeur, until we reached a pair of heavy walnut doors. He hesitated, then pushed them open. The room beyond was grand, though it bore the dust of disuse. A large carpet spread beneath high windows, and on the far wall, surrounded by oak wainscoting, hung the portrait. Even having seen it earlier in Baker Street, I felt a faint tightening in my chest as I looked again into Lady Marchmont's eyes. There was something curiously sentient in their gaze, not fearsome, but unsettling, as though she regarded us each in turn and passed a silent judgment. Holmes wasted no time. He strode to the painting, pulling a small magnifying lens from his pocket. He scanned the borders of the canvas, the eyes, the shadows around the pupils. He sniffed lightly at the edge of the frame, then tapped it with a knuckle. "Hollow," he murmured, "but not empty." I approached to stand beside him, watching his every motion. "What are you seeing?" "Not yet enough to form a theory, but I am acquiring data." He moved to the rear of the portrait and examined the mounting. "Have there been any changes made to this wall in the past 6 months?" Fenwick shook his head. "None to my knowledge." Holmes crouched and examined the carpet beneath the painting, then looked up. "Watson, observe the edges of the frame. Do you see this fine powder? It's only present on the lower sill." I leaned closer. Indeed, a delicate dusting of grey-white particles clung to the frame's lower edge. "Plaster," Holmes confirmed. Disturbed, the source is not the painting itself, but behind it. Without further word, he produced a small penknife from his pocket and began prying delicately at the corner of the frame. Fenwick shifted uncomfortably. "Is this necessary?" "I assure you," Holmes said coolly, "no real art is ever harmed by truth." There was a faint click. Holmes stood back, then slowly pulled the entire painting forward on concealed hinges. Behind it was a shallow recess, and within that recess, neatly affixed to the wall, was a circular aperture no larger than a coin. A lens gleamed within it. "Good heavens," I said, "a peephole?" "Precisely," Holmes replied. "And more than that, look closely at the back of the portrait. You see this copper fitting and the way it aligns with the lens. Lady Marchmont's eyes were painted directly over a transparent medium. This is no mere painting. It is a cleverly designed viewing instrument. Someone was watching through it?" "Not merely watching," Holmes said, rising, "observing, listening perhaps, and likely recording." "Mr. Fenwick, what lies directly behind this wall?" He paled. "A storage corridor, disused but accessible. The servants often keep old furniture there." "May we inspect it?" Fenwick led us down another hall, dimly lit and narrow. The corridor behind the west drawing-room was plain and cold, lined with unused trunks and a few broken chairs. Holmes scanned the walls, finally stopping at a point directly behind the frame. He reached up and pressed against a loose panel. At once it gave way, revealing a small chamber not much larger than a wardrobe. Within it stood a simple wooden chair, a low shelf with a set of notebooks, and a curious apparatus, a brass cylinder mounted with a tube and a series of winding spools. "A phonograph," Holmes said, examining it with interest. "Used to record voices, and these notebooks. Watson, read me a sample entry." I took one and opened to a random page, my fingers stiff from the cold. The writing was elegant, female, and surprisingly meticulous. September 12th. The vicar visited. He suspects nothing, though his sympathies lie with Beatrice. I must maintain distance. The third drawer in the escritoire remains untouched. Another entry. September 18th. Henry's coughing worsens. The tonic is nearly finished. He still does not know it contains laudanum. I fear what may be required if he grows suspicious. I looked up, disturbed. "This is Lady Marchmont's diary." "It would appear so," Holmes replied, flipping another notebook open. "Though its presence here, hidden and paired with a surveillance device, is more telling than the contents themselves. But why would she be spying on her own guests? An excellent question, one that invites another. Who continued to access this place after her death?" Fenwick was visibly shaken. "No one. Not to my knowledge. We sealed off the West Wing weeks ago. I myself have not been in this corridor since, at least midsummer." Holmes paced the narrow space, deep in thought. "The method of surveillance is clear. The motive is not. Nor is it obvious who now uses this room, if indeed it is still in use." He turned to Fenwick. "You mentioned that the disturbances continued after the painting was removed to the attic. Did anything in particular escalate?" Fenwick nodded slowly. "Yes. 2 weeks ago, a guest, Colonel Aspinall, stayed the night. He said he awoke to the feeling of being watched and claimed he saw a flicker of movement from behind the portrait, but we had already removed it. That same night, my valet found a slip of paper tucked into the guest ledger. It read, 'She knows who poisoned the tonic.'" Holmes gave a rare moment of silence. When he spoke, his voice was low. "May I see this paper?" Fenwick retrieved it from a desk drawer. Holmes took it with a gloved hand and held it to the light. "Typewritten," he said, "on a Remington, judging by the spacing and the shape of the capital S. Likely typed by someone literate and cautious. No handwriting to identify." He turned to me. "Watson, we are no longer investigating the unease caused by a painting. We are now confronting a mystery involving surveillance, poison, and what appears to be a carefully orchestrated campaign of fear." "And perhaps a murderer?" I asked quietly. "Quite possibly, but not yet proven." Holmes looked once more at the hidden chamber. "I must study these notebooks in full. Tonight we remain here. Mr. Fenwick, might we trouble you for accommodation?" "Of course," Fenwick said at once, though unease lingered behind his civility. As we ascended the stairs toward the guest rooms, Holmes paused at a window and looked out into the darkened grounds. "She knew something," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "Lady Marchmont, and she meant to leave a record. The eyes in the frame were not hers, but they may yet reveal the killer." The wind sighed through the trees outside our guest chamber, rustling branches like cautious footsteps just beyond reach. Inside, the fire crackled faintly, its warmth welcome in the otherwise oppressive silence that had settled over Marchmont Hall. Holmes sat by the writing desk, his thin, nervous fingers flicking rapidly through the pages of Lady Marchmont's hidden notebooks. I reclined in an armchair, making notes in my journal by candlelight, though my thoughts wandered continually to the hidden chamber, and to the notion that someone, perhaps still among the living, had once watched from behind the painted eyes of the late lady. Holmes, after a prolonged pause, made a low humming noise, somewhere between a grunt of irritation and interest. "You found something?" I asked. He tapped the open page in front of him. Yes, a thread, or perhaps only the suggestion of one. Listen to this entry, dated the 12th of June, just 3 weeks before Lady Marchmont's death. Beatrice's flirtations with Henry are no longer harmless. I've warned her, subtly at first, but she mistakes restraint for weakness. Henry suspects nothing. I, however, cannot afford to pretend. If she pushes further, I may be forced to speak. Beatrice, I repeated. A member of the household? The younger cousin of Lady Marchmont, Holmes replied. I recall Fenwick mentioning her name briefly over dinner. She has remained at the Hall since Lady Marchmont's death, allegedly to help manage affairs. I believe we must speak to her. He closed the notebook with a decisive snap, then rose. Come, Watson, the hour is not late, and I doubt we shall sleep until we have cast more light on the shadow that clings to this house. We found Miss Beatrice Marchmont in the South Library, seated beside a towering cabinet of legal volumes. She was younger than I had expected, no more than 27, with golden brown hair and a calm, measured expression that suggested intelligence, though I thought I caught a flicker of wariness when Holmes entered. I was told you were here, she said, rising. You must forgive the disarray. My cousin Basil means well, but the household has been in a state of quiet panic for weeks. Holmes inclined his head. Miss Marchmont, I appreciate your candour. May we speak frankly? By all means. Holmes studied her for a moment, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. Lady Evangeline kept a set of private journals, carefully hidden, as well as a phonographic device behind the portrait in the west drawing-room. Did you know of their existence? Her composure faltered, just for a breath, but she recovered with admirable speed. I suspected. She was a private woman, and often spent hours in that room with the door locked. I had no idea what she did there. I never asked. She wrote of you, Miss Marchmont, Holmes continued, with concern, particularly about your relationship with Henry, her husband. Now the colour drained from her face. There was no relationship, she said quickly. Henry was kind to me, that is all. Evangeline imagined things. She was always possessive. She believed you were advancing beyond friendliness. Beatrice turned away, walking slowly toward the window. What she believed and what was true were not the same. I never returned Henry's attentions. Yes, he paid me compliments, but I knew it could lead nowhere. I cared for her too much to allow it. Then let me ask you plainly, who besides you knew Lady Marchmont kept records behind the portrait? No one, Beatrice said softly. At least, none that she would have trusted. Basil, perhaps, though I doubt it. And Henry, if he found out, well, it would not have ended peacefully. Why do you say that? Because, she said, turning back to us, he was terrified of her. We left her with a promise to disturb her no further that night, though her final remark rang in my ears. Henry Marchmont, terrified of his own wife. It seemed incongruous with what little we'd heard about him. Holmes said nothing until we were back in our own rooms. Then he opened his violin case and began to tune the instrument in silence, plucking a string here, tightening another there. Finally, he said, Watson, I want you to ask yourself a question. I'm listening. Lady Marchmont was recording private conversations. She was noting suspicions about her cousin. She was clearly afraid something was being kept from her. Why would she take such pains to collect this information? She suspected someone meant her harm? Perhaps. Or perhaps she was gathering leverage. But here's the more curious question. Why did the recordings and journals remain hidden after her death? Why were they not discovered during the cleaning of the West Wing? They were well concealed. Holmes shook his head. Number They were deliberately left there. The portrait wasn't moved until recently, and no effort was made to remove the phonograph or the notebooks. It's almost as if someone wanted them to remain, but not be found until now. Planted evidence? Or a posthumous warning? The following morning, after a brief breakfast, Holmes requested a private word with Mr. Fenwick in the conservatory. The two men conversed quietly among the wintering orchids while I reviewed the previous night's notes. When they rejoined me, Holmes proposed that we interview the final person of interest, Mr. Henry Marchmont himself. We found the widower seated in a smoking room at the rear of the house, paging through a copy of Punch. He was in his late 50s, with heavy jowls and thinning auburn hair, but he rose with courteous ease when introduced. "My wife," he said, once Holmes had stated his purpose, "was a woman of strong character, a sharp mind. Some would call her cold, but I saw in her a brilliance that intimidated lesser souls." "And were you among the intimidated?" Holmes asked lightly. Henry gave a dry chuckle. "At times. Evangeline could be fierce. I loved her, of course, but how shall I put it? She did not suffer dissent." Holmes turned toward the fire. Lady Marchmont was keeping secret records, diaries, surveillance equipment. That shook him. He sat down heavily. "You're certain?" "Quite. She never mentioned such things." "Did you suspect her of watching you?" He hesitated, then nodded. She had a way of knowing things before they were said aloud. At times it was as if she could read a man's thoughts. I assumed it was instinct, but if she had help, mechanical help, then some things make more sense now. "Such as?" He looked down at his hands. 3 weeks before she died, we quarrelled, badly, over Beatrice. She accused me of intentions I never acted upon. She said I had betrayed her. I left the room. That was the last time we spoke in private. Holmes stepped forward. "Did she ever mention a tonic?" "Yes, she took a bitter preparation every evening, said it helped her nerves. I never asked what was in it." "But you knew it was kept in her bedroom?" "Yes, in the drawer of her writing desk." Holmes was silent for a beat, then said, "Thank you, Mr. Marchmont. You've been most helpful." We withdrew once more to our guest room, where Holmes sat abruptly and began sketching in his notebook. I stood beside him, waiting. He tapped his pencil against the margin. "It is forming, Watson, a triangle of fear. Lady Marchmont suspected betrayal from Beatrice, from her husband, perhaps from both. She gathered evidence, but then she died. Peacefully, we are told, but her records indicate otherwise." "You suspect murder?" "I suspect the appearance of peace can be manufactured." I felt the familiar chill I had known many times before, when Holmes stepped across the line from curiosity into danger. "Tonight," he said, "we test a theory. But first, we find the tonic." Holmes wasted no time. The moment Henry Marchmont retreated down the corridor, Holmes signalled to me, and we ascended the west staircase to the late Lady Marchmont's private quarters. The corridors grew colder the higher we climbed, and the smell of old lavender and wood polish lingered like the memory of someone not quite departed. The bedroom, when we reached it, was untouched since her passing, furnished with care but lacking any warmth. A portrait of Lady Marchmont in later years hung above the fireplace, less severe than the youthful image in the drawing-room, but no less commanding. "She ruled this house even from here," Holmes muttered, his eyes scanning the room with a practised detachment. He went straight to the mahogany writing desk by the window, where a single silver hairbrush still lay beside a stopped clock. The desk drawers were locked, but Holmes withdrew a thin steel tool from his coat pocket and, with a practised turn of his wrist, the lock yielded. Inside were neatly arranged papers, a faded locket, and, tucked in the back corner, a small corked bottle of amber fluid, half full. The label was partially rubbed away, but still legible in parts, Cordia tonic. Nightly dosage. Holmes held it up to the light. Note the residue along the neck, Watson. It has been handled recently. This is not a relic. It is still in use. But she's been dead for months, I said. Who would... He stopped me with a glance and carefully extracted a folded note tucked beneath the bottle. The paper was yellowed, brittle with age, but the handwriting was unmistakably Lady Marchmont's. If I should fall ill, let no physician touch this tonic until it has been tested. I trust no one entirely. There is something wrong. The taste is altered. Holmes's expression sharpened. She knew, perhaps not the precise method, but she knew something had changed. Poisoned? He nodded, slipping the bottle into his pocket. It must be tested. I shall send it to Bart's with instructions. But even without confirmation, we must treat this as an attempted, perhaps successful, murder. He returned the drawer's contents exactly as they had been, closed it, and crossed to the wardrobe, inspecting the hinges, the floor beneath, and the skirting. Then he paused, knelt, and withdrew a folded sheaf of paper from the space beneath the floorboard. Another letter, this one unsealed. Holmes read aloud, "To whoever finds this, know that I did not go gently." I saw them whispering. I heard the door close softly at night when I had not the strength to rise. There was someone behind the frame again, twice in 1 week. The tonic grows bitter. I fear I have been silenced already. Though my voice remains in ink and coil, let it be heard. He rose slowly. She left a trail, he said. Not just words, but intent. She wanted the truth found, even if it came too late to save her. We returned downstairs to send the tonic by special courier to London. Holmes provided exacting instructions and a sealed envelope addressed to his contact at St. Bartholomew's. When the task was complete, he turned his attention back to the household. "Tonight," he said, "we test whether the danger is past or merely asleep." He spoke to Fenwick privately, requesting that none of the household be allowed near the west drawing-room after 10 o'clock. Fenwick complied, though unease played about his eyes. Beatrice, whom we passed in the hallway, paused to regard us. "You've discovered something, haven't you?" she said quietly. "We are approaching the edge of it," Holmes replied. "If there's danger—" "There is always danger when lies persist," he said without softness. "Keep to your room tonight, Miss Marchmont. I cannot promise what may unfold." By nightfall, a silence had descended over the house more profound than any we'd yet experienced. The staff had retired early, either out of fear or instruction, and Marchmont Hall seemed to hold its breath. Holmes and I stationed ourselves in the west drawing-room, now restored to its previous arrangement. The portrait once more on the wall, concealing its dark secret. Holmes had taken the liberty of setting a delicate bell wire from the hidden viewing chamber to the leg of a chair he occupied in the corner. The smallest pressure on the floorboard within would set it ringing faintly, a clever trap. We waited. The hours passed in stillness. The fire burned low. I confess my mind drifted more than once towards sleep, but Holmes remained upright, still as the carved mantelpiece beside him. Then, sometime shortly after 1 o'clock, the bell gave a whispering ting. Holmes rose at once, his finger to his lips. We heard it then, the faintest rustle behind the wall, like breath caught in a throat. A cautious footstep. Then the faint creak of weight shifting on wood. Holmes crossed the room in 2 swift strides and pressed against the panel. It gave way, and the chamber beyond stood empty. I followed, breath held tight, but there was no one inside. The chair was slightly askew, the phonograph half unwound, a fresh wax cylinder glinting on the shelf. "Too late," I muttered. "They heard us." "No," Holmes said. "They never entered." "But they left a message." He retrieved the wax cylinder and examined it. Fresh, still warm, it was recorded just now. We returned to our rooms with the device in tow. Holmes wound it carefully, adjusted the needle, and let it play. There was a crackle. Then a woman's voice, soft, precise, unmistakably Lady Marchmont's. If you are hearing this, then my fears were not in vain. Someone has used the frame again. There is treachery in this house, deep and long prepared. Beatrice, if you are listening, forgive me. I tried to protect you, even from the truth. And Henry, my husband, you poisoned my tonic, didn't you? Or had someone else do it? You were always too weak to act, but strong enough to conspire. Did you think I wouldn't notice? I watched. I recorded. I knew. Let justice speak where I no longer can. The cylinder ended in a soft whir. We sat in silence. She named them, I said at last. Both. She named them, but a confession is not a conviction, Holmes said grimly. Lady Marchmont's voice carries no legal weight, especially after her death. We must confront the facts, Watson. This message was prepared before she died, yet it speaks as if recorded only moments ago. You think someone played an old recording to throw us off? Possibly. Or someone who wanted to appear innocent made use of her voice to deflect suspicion. But who? Holmes leaned back, eyes distant. There is one name she did not mention, Mr. Basil Fenwick. Yet he was the only person who handled the painting before it was brought to us, the only person who remained calm while the others feared. And now the only person with consistent access to every room in this house. You suspect Fenwick? I consider all possibilities, but I intend to test them. Tomorrow we shall speak to the housekeeper and a former servant, someone who fled after Lady Marchmont's death. I believe they hold the final threads. And if they do not— He fell silent, then whispered. Then we returned to the frame, and to the eyes that still watch. Morning at Marchmont Hall came reluctantly, as though the house itself resented the intrusion of light. Fog clung low over the fields and hedgerows, and the rooms retained their shadows like secrets not yet prepared to surrender. Holmes was already dressed and writing when I awoke, the smell of strong coffee rising from a silver carafe on the table. His eyes were sharper than ever, focused, alert, yet brimming with some inner calculation I could not yet interpret. There has been movement in the night, he said without turning, but it was not from the guilty. I sat up and reached for the coffee. Explain. The message we heard last night was not fabricated. It was Lady Marchmont's voice, yes, but the cylinder had not aged. It was freshly recorded. Someone had access to her original dictation, or the phonograph itself. Either way, it was meant as a provocation, to whom I am not yet certain. I stared at him. But surely, if she named Henry and Beatrice in that message— She named them, yes, Holmes cut in. But that could have been anticipated if she truly recorded those words shortly before her death. Then someone may have preserved them to use at a moment most convenient, to either obscure their own involvement or force someone else into action. He rose and slipped the wax cylinder back into its tin. I've arranged to speak with the former housemaid, Martha Stowe. She left the hall quite suddenly after Lady Marchmont's death. Fenwick provided her address without hesitation, a cottage in the village. And you think she might have seen something? I think she might have heard something. Those who serve listen more often than they speak. The walk into the village was brisk and silent. I had long learned that Holmes preferred quiet when his mind was stirring, and I knew better than to interrupt his thoughts with idle speculation. The path wound through frost-tipped hedges and stone walls slick with dew. The cottage lay just beyond a copse of larch. its chimney issuing a gentle plume of smoke. Martha Stowe answered the door herself. She was a woman in her 40s with pinched features, wrapped in a shawl that had seen better years. Her eyes darted between us as Holmes introduced himself, but when he mentioned Lady Marchmont, something in her posture stiffened. "I've said all I care to," she began, voice tight. "And yet," Holmes replied gently, "a woman like Lady Marchmont does not die with whispers in the walls and watching eyes unless someone knows why. I believe you do." Martha hesitated, then stepped aside. 5 minutes, she said. "No more." Inside, the cottage was neat but modest. She gestured toward 2 chairs, then took her own by the hearth. "I never trusted that house," she said, without prompting. "Not after last spring. It was quiet, too quiet." Her ladyship was a hard woman, yes, but she never inspired fear until she started locking her door at night. "Did you ever hear her speak of the tonic?" I asked. She nodded. "I fetched it most nights. Brown bottle, bitter smell. She only started drinking it regular around May. Said it helped her sleep, but she began to complain of headaches after, then the coughing." "You suspected foul play?" Holmes asked. Martha looked away. "I suspected watching. Her ladyship had me move a chair in the drawing-room one day, just beneath that painting. When I asked why, she said, 'Sometimes people forget they can be seen.'" "Did anyone else use that room?" She nodded, slower this time. "Mr. Fenwick, often. More than once I found him standing before that portrait, just staring up at it. Not admiring it, just listening. I thought it strange." Holmes's expression sharpened. "Listening?" "Aye, like he was waiting to hear something." Holmes stood. "Thank you, Miss Stowe, you've told us what we needed." She looked up at him. "If it were poison, you tell someone proper, don't let it pass like nothing." "I assure you," he said, "it will not." As we walked back toward the hall, Holmes was silent for several strides. Then he said, "This fits. The question is whether it fits too neatly. You believe Fenwick is being framed. I believe someone wanted his name to surface now, just as the voice recording did. If Lady Marchmont left such accusations behind, why did no one retrieve or destroy them sooner? Perhaps they didn't know where they were. Or perhaps, Holmes said grimly, they left them in place, waiting until they were more useful than dangerous. We returned to the hall just as a telegram arrived from London. Holmes read it swiftly, then handed it to me. "Substance contains laudanum in excessive concentration, deliberately altered, lethal over time, death consistent with chronic ingestion. Bart's Toxicology Division." Holmes folded the telegram. "There it is, confirmation. She was poisoned, slowly, deliberately, with intention to simulate a decline, likely administered in small doses so symptoms mirrored fatigue and age. We found Fenwick in the study. Holmes wasted no time. Mr. Fenwick, Lady Marchmont's tonic was poisoned. She knew it. She left messages, recordings, writings, all pointing to someone within this household." Fenwick paled. "Then it was Henry or Beatrice. It had to be—" "Did it?" Holmes said softly. "She named them, yes, but naming them posthumously is easy. It could have been a misdirection." "You think I—" Fenwick faltered. "That's absurd." "You handled the portrait," Holmes said. "You had access to the recording chamber, and you conveniently brought the painting to me just as suspicion crested in this house. Either you feared the truth would surface, or you meant to direct it." Fenwick stood, trembling now. "I brought it to you because I was afraid of what I didn't understand." Holmes took a step forward. "You knew about the chamber, the bell wire, the notebooks." "I didn't," Fenwick snapped. "Not until I found the servant's ledger. It had notes, marginalia, written in her hand. One line said, The frame sees more than the eyes. I thought it was poetry until I stood in that room and felt watched. Holmes narrowed his eyes. And so you came to me. To you, or to the police. But I thought you might uncover the truth without scandal for her sake. There was silence. Then Holmes said, well, one more question. When did you first see Beatrice and Henry whispering? Fenwick blinked. I never said they whispered. You did not, Holmes replied, his voice low and satisfied. But Lady Marchmont did, and yet the only people who knew that, until the recording last night, were me, Watson, and the one who made it. Fenwick took a breath, froze, then sat heavily. You can't prove I did it? Holmes moved to the window. Perhaps not in court, but consider this. Your motives were stronger than you let on. You loved her, didn't you? Fenwick stared at him. Yes, Holmes continued. You loved Evangeline. And when she turned cold, when she confided her suspicions in her diary and not in you, you chose silence. You watched, you listened, and you learned how to silence her completely. She was becoming paranoid, Fenwick said hoarsely. She suspected everyone, even me. She recorded me once without my knowledge. I heard it. I heard myself accuse her of cruelty. That voice haunted me. So you poisoned her, Holmes said, almost gently. And now you have tried to shift the blame toward Henry, toward Beatrice. But you failed. Fenwick said nothing. Then, without a word, he rose and left the study. Holmes did not stop him. He will not run, he said. There is nowhere to go, but he knows he has been seen by the very eyes he thought he had blinded. And with that, we prepared for the end. Fenwick did not appear again that evening, nor was he seen at breakfast the following morning. A footman confirmed that his bed had been slept in, but he had not come down. Holmes, composed as ever, made no move to pursue him immediately. Instead, he spent the early hours walking the length of the west corridor, pausing often near the portrait, his hands clasped behind his back and his gaze distant. I recognized this mood, a period of quiet consolidation, when the last pieces of the puzzle begin shifting into place behind that remarkable brow. He won't flee, Holmes said at last. Fenwick's not a fool. He's too methodical to vanish in panic, and he knows escape would only confirm guilt. I nodded. But surely the local constable must be informed. Soon, Holmes replied. Escape, but not yet. There is one last ambiguity I must resolve before we place this matter into the hands of the law. Ambiguity? Holmes turned toward the portrait again. There is still the matter of the recording, not the voice, but its timing. Fenwick did not know the contents of Lady Marchmont's final dictation, yet he quoted a phrase spoken only in the recording. Therefore, either he heard it before we did, or he helped create it. But if he made it, I said slowly, why would he leave it to be discovered? Because, Holmes said, he believed it would cast suspicion elsewhere. The recording is genuine, yes, but its use was deliberate. The question is whether Fenwick had exclusive access to that chamber before we arrived. He paused at the foot of the staircase, eyes narrowed. Watson, I need you to accompany me to the phonograph chamber. Bring the cylinder. I fetched it from the guest room, carefully packed in the tin box. Together we descended once more into the narrow passage behind the west drawing-room. The hidden door creaked open under Holmes's touch, revealing the familiar dust-choked shadows of the surveillance space. Holmes lit a lantern and crouched by the phonograph, inspecting the fittings and the wax cylinders stacked neatly to the side. He lifted one at random, sniffed it, and then examined its surface with a magnifying lens. These are all older, he murmured. The dust is undisturbed, but this... He tapped the recording we had played, the one with Lady Marchmont's final words. "This one is clean. It was either played recently or placed here within the last 2 days." I watched him closely. "Are you suggesting that someone else besides Fenwick could have accessed this space?" "Possibly," Holmes said. "But let us test a hypothesis. Note, Watson, that this wax cylinder is unmarked, no title, no date. Every other one here is labelled in Lady Marchmont's own hand: Colonel Aspinall, July, Garden Conversation, May, and so forth. So this one stands apart?" "Yes," Holmes said. "Now let us ask why." He opened the phonograph case and removed the internal cylinder arm. Inside, hidden beneath the machinery, lay a false compartment. Holmes pried it open with the flat of his knife and extracted a bundle of wax tissue paper, wrapping perhaps for an unused cylinder. "It was planted," Holmes said softly. "The message wasn't just preserved, it was reintroduced." "But who would do that?" Holmes's face darkened with thought. "Someone with an interest in ensuring Fenwick appeared guilty, either to shield themselves or to end the matter altogether. Someone who knew the portrait's secret or had discovered it recently." He turned suddenly. "There is one who fits that description, and one whose proximity to the key events has been too conveniently understated." I felt a cold prickle of recognition. "Beatrice?" She knew of the West Drawing-Room's unease. She acknowledged her strained relationship with Lady Marchmont, and she had access to this part of the house long after Fenwick claimed to have closed it off. Moreover, she had motive. If Lady Marchmont had confronted her cousin, or intended to disinherit her, Beatrice would have every reason to act. But the poison? She may not have administered it herself, but recall what Lady Marchmont wrote. "Henry still does not know it contains laudanum. That implies someone else prepared it." "So you believe Beatrice poisoned the tonic?" "I believe she orchestrated it," Holmes said, "or at the very least encouraged it. But her true manipulation lies in the framing of Fenwick." "Then what now?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Now we let the frame watch once more." That evening, Holmes requested that Beatrice join us in the West Drawing-Room after supper. She arrived punctually, composed and courteous, her expression a mixture of curiosity and caution. "I was told you wanted to see me," she said. Holmes gestured toward a chair directly beneath the portrait. "Yes, Miss Marchmont. I thought it was time we clarified a few remaining uncertainties." She sat, glancing once at the painting above her. "It still unnerves me, you know. I half expect her to speak." "In a way," Holmes said, "she already has." Beatrice looked at him, frowning slightly. "You mean the recording?" "Exactly. We've confirmed that the wax cylinder was placed there recently, deliberately and by someone who wanted to mislead us." "I assumed it had been hidden all along," she said carefully. "A reasonable assumption," Holmes replied. "Unless, of course, one had discovered it in the attic weeks ago and decided to put it to use." Her eyes narrowed. "You're implying I did so?" "I imply nothing," Holmes said. "But I invite you to consider how unusual it is for someone to reintroduce a damning piece of evidence rather than destroy it, unless they believe it will convict the wrong person." Beatrice stood. "Mr. Holmes, I will not be spoken to in this way." Holmes raised a hand. "Miss Marchmont, before you go I should mention that a second recording was found this morning, one made after Lady Marchmont's death. It mentions your attempt to manipulate Fenwick, to convince him that Lady Marchmont had grown paranoid, that her suspicions were baseless. You preyed on his guilt, did you not?" Her face went still. "You saw the tonic," Holmes continued. "You may not have poisoned it yourself, but you let Henry believe it was harmless. and when Lady Marchmont grew suspicious, you arranged for her death to appear natural. But when the painting threatened to reveal too much, when the portrait was to be moved, you planted the recording, a final flourish, carefully timed. Beatrice's hands clenched at her sides. You have no proof. Not in the legal sense, Holmes said, but the phonograph remembers, and so does the housekeeper who saw you leaving the West Corridor 2 nights ago, long after Fenwick was in bed. Beatrice stared at him, her composure finally cracking. She was tearing us apart, she said, voice low and shaking. Watching us, judging us, me. She wanted to cut me from the will. She told me as much. You've disappointed me, she said. You have no place here. Well, I made a place. Holmes said nothing. She turned to me then, voice rising. Henry was too weak, Fenwick too sentimental, but I did what had to be done. Holmes moved to the bell cord and pulled once. 2 constables, summoned earlier by telegram, entered quietly through the rear. Miss Beatrice Marchmont, Holmes said, you will come with these gentlemen. She did not resist, and as she passed beneath the portrait, her eyes lifted once, just once, to meet the painted gaze of Lady Marchmont. Whether she saw remorse, judgment, or triumph there, I could not say. But I do know this, the frame had watched, and it had remembered. The arrest of Beatrice Marchmont cast a hush over the entire household, as though the very walls of Marchmont Hall exhaled a long-held breath. The constables had taken her without incident, their carriage wheels crunching over gravel just after midnight. I remained near the fire in the west drawing-room, my thoughts spinning as I stared once more at the portrait that had borne witness to secrets too long buried. Holmes lingered beside the mantelpiece, his silhouette tall and still in the flickering light. For some time he said nothing, merely gazing into the flames, his hands loosely clasped behind his back. I had learned by now to wait in such moments when his mind was working beneath the surface like the slow grind of distant gears. At last he stirred, breaking the silence. She confessed to the orchestration, he said softly, but not to the act itself. I looked up, startled. Do you mean the poisoning? Exactly. Beatrice manipulated events, no doubt. She exploited others' weaknesses, played upon their fears, their guilt. But there is one critical fact we've not yet accounted for. He turned to face me, the shadows painting hard lines across his cheekbones. Lady Marchmont herself believed Henry to be the one administering the tonic. Yet she stated, he still does not know it contains laudanum. That suggests another hand entirely. I felt a fresh unease rise within me. Then Beatrice was not the only one complicit. Holmes nodded. We must return once more to the start. Recall, Lady Marchmont became suspicious of Beatrice's affections for Henry, but it was not jealousy alone that caused her to act. She began monitoring the household. She built the chamber. She started recording. He moved to the desk and laid out the sequence of notebooks we had retrieved. Now observe this entry, dated June 4th. Martha brings the tonic. It tastes different now, slightly sweeter, less bitterness on the tongue. A new bottle, perhaps? Or someone tampering? I leaned forward, my memory catching up. She suspected her maid? She suspected something had changed, but note the detail. Martha brought it. Not Henry, not Beatrice. It was Martha. But surely she was questioned, I said. You interviewed her yourself. I listened to her, Holmes replied. And what she did not say was more important than what she did. She described the tonic. She said she fetched it nightly, but she never mentioned preparing it. Nor did she claim ignorance of its composition. That, Watson, is the gap. My mind raced. Then she... Yes, Martha Stowe may not have been the architect, but she was the instrument, the poisoner. But why? I asked, rising. She had no inheritance to gain, no standing in the household. Motives, my dear Watson, are not always forged of greed or ambition. Sometimes they are born of gratitude, loyalty, or fear. There was a knock at the door. A servant entered with a note. Holmes opened it, scanned the contents, and handed it to me without comment. From the Inspector of Hertfordshire Constabulary, Beatrice Marchmont maintains she never touched the tonic, claims her cousin Basil had approached Martha repeatedly in the weeks prior to Lady Marchmont's death. Fenwick, when questioned, denied this. Martha's whereabouts now unknown. "She's fled," I murmured. "No," Holmes said. "She's hiding, likely close. She would not have gone far, not without preparation. And Fenwick, despite his involvement, was only half aware of the greater scheme." Holmes crossed to the door. "Come, Watson, there is one place we've yet to inspect properly." We descended to the servants' quarters, a plain set of rooms near the back of the house, their simplicity in sharp contrast to the richness above. Holmes moved with careful precision, scanning each door, each passage, before stopping before a small storage room wedged between the scullery and the laundry. He pressed his ear to the door. Then, without ceremony, he opened it. Martha Stowe stood within, a suitcase in hand. She did not scream or flinch, only looked up at us with weary resignation. "I wondered how long it would take," she said softly. Holmes stepped forward, his tone even. "You were loyal to Lady Marchmont once. Why did you betray her?"
"I didn't," she said quickly. "Not at first. I watched her grow colder, angrier. She accused everyone, her husband, her kin, the staff. She said we whispered behind her back. She started listening at doors. She stopped trusting even me." "You put the laudanum in the tonic." "Yes," she whispered. "But I didn't decide it alone, Mr. Fenwick. He said it would help her rest, just a little. Calmer. He gave me the first bottle. He said it was medicinal. When she started coughing, I begged him to stop, but by then she was too far gone. And Beatrice? She came to me after the coughing started, told me not to say a word, that Lady Marchmont would accuse me if she found out. She said I'd be ruined, dismissed. I panicked. I did what they asked." Holmes regarded her steadily. "You poisoned her, slowly, consistently, perhaps out of fear or self-preservation, but you killed her." Martha's face crumpled. "I know." Holmes turned to me. "Fetch the inspector, Watson. This time there will be no ambiguity. Let the law account for each thread." I did as he asked, returning with the constables not 20 minutes later. Martha surrendered without protest. Her face was pale but composed, as though the weight of concealment had finally lifted. When we were alone once more, Holmes stood in the empty drawing-room, beneath the ever-watching eyes of Lady Marchmont. "She built the trap," he said quietly. "Not for revenge, but for truth. She saw her end approaching, and ensured it would not be cloaked in shadows." I followed his gaze. The painted eyes stared forward still, unblinking, unchanging. "She trusted the frame more than the people around her," I said. "Indeed," Holmes murmured. "And she was not wrong." As we prepared to leave Marchmont Hall the following morning, I looked back once at the great house. The fog had lifted, and the grounds were bathed in a cold, clear light. Holmes stood beside the carriage, his coat collar turned against the breeze, watching with that peculiar stillness that marked his most reflective moods. "Well," I said, climbing in beside him, "you've done it again." Holmes said nothing for a moment. Then, "Not I, Watson." She did. She left the truth behind. I merely translated it. He settled into his seat, and the driver cracked the reins. As the hall faded behind us, I saw once more those painted eyes, high in the window, watching, no longer with warning, but with justice served. The return journey to London passed in relative silence. Holmes, swathed in his Inverness cape, sat with his gaze fixed out the window, not upon the shifting countryside, but somewhere deeper, farther, within. I could tell the matter of Marchmont Hall still turned in his mind. Though the facts had been laid bare and the guilty named, something unsettled lingered in his expression like a book left open at its
final page. It was not until the lights of the outer boroughs began to flicker past that he finally spoke. "There remains an oddity, Watson." I looked up from my notes. Concerning? Concerning the aftermath. Not the poisoning itself, that has been established with regrettable clarity, but rather the orchestration. There is something too neat in how the blame was poised, handed from one pair of hands to another, like a passing chalice. Beatrice, Fenwick, Martha, all complicit, but who held the original design? You don't believe it was Beatrice? She was clever, yes, calculating, but not careful enough. Her role, though significant, was reactive. I believe she adapted to events already in motion. Then who? I asked. Holmes tilted his head, the hint of a smile on his lips. Let us not be hasty. Consider what we've learned. Lady Marchmont's paranoia did not begin with Beatrice. It began earlier, when the tonic changed, when the whispering started, when she began to suspect the walls were not empty. I felt a chill. Are you suggesting someone else manipulated even Beatrice? Holmes's eyes gleamed. Exactly, and I believe that person left behind one last message. We simply have not seen it yet. We arrived at Baker Street just before dusk. Holmes wasted no time in unpacking the materials brought from Marchmont Hall, the notebooks, the unlabelled wax cylinders, and the sketch of the hidden chamber. He spread them across the sitting-room floor like a battlefield map. Watson, he said, I want you to reread the final entries in the diary. Slowly, aloud, look for anything that stands out. I did as asked, returning to the final 3 pages Lady Marchmont had written. Her hand grew increasingly uneven, the lines slanting toward the margin. There was desperation in the ink, but also calculation. And then, near the end, I came across it. She writes, I cannot name them, not yet, but they know I see them. I see them in the glass. I see them watching when no one should. I left the truth behind the eyes. I left it behind the third eye. I paused. Holmes turned slowly. Repeat that. Behind the third eye. Holmes stood abruptly and moved to the desk, snatching up his magnifying glass. She was not speaking metaphorically, not entirely. Recall the portrait, the painting of her younger self. Her eyes were fitted with a lens, yes, but perhaps there was more. Something even we missed. Before I could ask further, he had seized his coat once again. Come, Watson, we're going back. Back? To Marchmont Hall? He nodded. Tonight, before the trail grows cold. We arrived well past nightfall with only the wind and the sound of gravel crunching beneath the carriage wheels to greet us. Fenwick had not returned. The house was under the watch of 2 constables stationed discreetly near the west wing, their lanterns casting soft arcs of light over the gravel paths. Holmes gave them a nod, then led the way inside. We returned to the west drawing-room. It was as it had been left. Quiet, dust motes spiralling in the candlelight, the portrait of Lady Marchmont in place. Holmes moved directly to the painting. Look closely, Watson. Count the reflections. I joined him, peering carefully at the face rendered in oils. There are 2 eyes, naturally. Number 3. He angled the lantern up toward the top of the canvas. At first, I saw nothing. Then the light caught on a small, barely perceptible bump in the paint. nestled just above the bridge of the nose, hidden in the shadows cast by her brow. It was a minuscule dome of glass, subtly embedded in the canvas. Holmes took his penknife and gently pried at the paint. A thin slice gave way, revealing a small lens, no larger than a shilling, hidden within a recess of the wooden frame. "The third eye," Holmes said softly. "Not a metaphor at all." Behind it there was a shallow cavity, and nestled inside, wrapped in oilskin, was a folded letter. He unwrapped it with care. The handwriting was shakier than the rest of her diary, and the ink had faded slightly, but it was unmistakably Lady Marchmont's. To whom this may fall, know this: I have named none because I am no longer certain. I believed it to be Beatrice, then Basil, even Henry, but the voices behind the wall did not match their tones, and someone tampered with the cylinders, played them back when no one should have been near. I fear the truth lies deeper. I fear there is another, a ghost within this house who lives in shadows and silence. If you find this, you must know the poison may not have begun with fear. It may have begun with obsession. Look not to the drawing room, look beneath. Holmes closed the letter and stood motionless for a moment. "Watson," he said slowly, "the truth is still buried." "Beneath what?" He turned to me, his voice grave. "The house." We made our way to the cellar with haste, passing sleeping servants and locked cabinets. The cellar, unused for years, lay beneath the north wing. Dust thickened the air as we descended, our lanterns struggling against the darkness. Holmes paused at the bottom of the steps and examined the floor. "Here." There were marks in the stone, faint, almost erased, scratches in a half-circle pattern, as though something heavy had once been rotated there. Holmes crouched and ran his fingers along the mortar between the stones. One slab was newer, less worn. Together we pried it up. Beneath was a cavity no larger than a suitcase. Inside it, wrapped in oilcloth and bound with twine, was a stack of documents, letters, and a journal, not Lady Marchmont's, but Basil Fenwick's. Holmes read quickly, turning page after page, and then he handed one to me. "She watches always, she writes always. Even when I do nothing, she thinks I've conspired." I moved the bottle once, only once, but she accused me with her eyes. I have listened from behind the wall, not to learn, but to be close. Her voice comforts me. Even now I play the recordings. She thinks they are for evidence, they are for me. I love her, she will never forgive me, but I will not stop. I cannot. Holmes closed the book. "It was not murder out of ambition," he said. "Not entirely, it was obsession. He loved her, controlled her, poisoned her slowly to ensure she would never leave the house, never stray too far." I stared at the final page, sickened. "And the others, Beatrice, Martha, were drawn into the web without knowing the full picture." She suspected Beatrice and Henry because that's what Fenwick wanted, and he recorded her words, preserved her anger, because even her rage was a way to keep her voice alive. Holmes returned the journal to the cavity and replaced the stone. "Now," he said quietly, "we tell Scotland Yard the full truth." We ascended in silence, the house above us still. And behind us, beneath the stones, the final whisper of Lady Marchmont lingered, clear, preserved, and no longer unheard. We returned from the cellar in the early hours of morning, our lanterns extinguished at the threshold of the servants' stairwell. A heavy silence pressed in upon Marchmont Hall, not the uneasy hush of fear, but the kind that follows a long-withheld truth finally spoken aloud. Holmes carried the bundle of Fenwick's letters and journals under his arm, each page now a weighty testament to a man who had blurred the line between love, possession, and quiet madness. In the drawing-room, beneath the portrait that had now become both sentinel and confessor, Holmes laid the bundle on the writing table. I watched his hands move methodically, arranging the papers by date, checking margins for marginalia. It was, I realized, not a matter of curiosity now. It was preservation. Final confirmation. The case was not as it first appeared, he said without lifting his gaze, nor even as it appeared when it was supposedly solved. No, I replied. It was far more tragic. He nodded faintly. A woman dies under suspicion of her own household, records every word in fear, and yet cannot see that the real threat hides not in betrayal, but in devotion unmoored from reason. We did not sleep. There was no point. By 7, Inspector Braithwaite had arrived from Hertfordshire Constabulary, summoned by Holmes's earlier telegram. He was a thick-set man with a moustache like a railway brush and a respectful deference to Holmes that came from past experience. "You've summoned me into a storm of ghosts, Mr. Holmes," he said, after being shown the portrait, the phonograph chamber, and the third eye. "Now you tell me there's yet another layer?" Holmes handed him Fenwick's journal, already marked at several incriminating entries. "You'll find the full account there," Holmes said. "A man driven not by gain but obsession. His control over Lady Marchmont grew gradually. At first, he isolated her through the use of the tonic, just enough laudanum to fatigue her senses. Later, when her suspicions grew, he increased the dosage to prevent her from confronting what she could no longer trust." "And the others?" Braithwaite asked. "The cousin? The maid?" "They played their parts," Holmes replied. "Unwittingly in the case of the maid, opportunistically in the case of Beatrice. Lady Marchmont believed herself betrayed because Fenwick encouraged that belief. He redirected her natural suspicions toward the people she already mistrusted. It kept the focus off himself and gave him the opportunity to frame them when the time came." Braithwaite frowned, flipping through the journal. "He speaks of playing her voice recordings over and over." "Yes," Holmes said, his voice low. "Even in her anger and paranoia she was still herself. To him, she was alive through those recordings. His twisted devotion ensured that she would never leave the house, not in life and not in death." Braithwaite stood back and rubbed his face. "We've arrested Beatrice Marchmont. The maid confessed to compounding the tonic. Now you're telling me the real killer is the man who claimed to be her protector?" "I am," Holmes said. "But the truth isn't always tidy. I suggest you read the rest of the journal before you decide how to proceed. The evidence is unequivocal. And Basil Fenwick." Holmes turned slightly toward the window, where the pale light of morning had begun to break through the fog. "He's still here, somewhere. He never fled, not truly. He's watching. He's always watching." Braithwaite dispatched 2 constables to search the house again, this time thoroughly, attic to cellar. Holmes, meanwhile, returned to the west corridor and stood for some time outside the drawing-room, gazing down the long hallway as if retracing each footstep that had passed beneath Lady Marchmont's gaze. It was just past 9 when the constables called down from the attic. "In here! We've found something!" We followed them to the uppermost floor of the house, beyond the servants' quarters, to a disused garret filled with forgotten trunks and broken furniture. There, crouched behind an overturned dresser and bundled in a moth-eaten blanket, sat Basil Fenwick. He did not resist. He didn't even look surprised. He only raised his eyes to Holmes with an expression I shall never forget, not fear, not defiance, but relief. "I thought she might forgive me," he said softly. "In time, if I kept her close." Braithwaite stepped forward. "Mr. Fenwick, you are under arrest for the murder of Lady Evangeline Marchmont by means of sustained poisoning with laudanum. Do you understand?" Fenwick gave a slight nod. She was never meant to die. I only wanted calm to quiet the storm in her. And then the others, Beatrice, Henry, they made it so easy to shift the blame. She believed what she feared. And the recordings? Holmes asked. I listened every night, Fenwick said, even after she died. I would come to the drawing room, rewind her words. Her voice kept me company. I loved her, even when she hated me. Braithwaite gestured, and the constables took Fenwick gently but firmly by the arms. He did not protest. As they led him away, he glanced once more at Holmes. Would they remember her? He asked. Not just what happened, but who she was. Holmes met his gaze evenly. Yes, he said, because she recorded it all. The constables led him down the stairs, and the house was silent again. Later that morning, Holmes and I stood for the last time in the west drawing-room. The portrait remained in place, its painted gaze unchanging, but now stripped of menace. The frame that once hid 1,000 secrets now seemed merely what it was, a likeness of a woman who had fought alone to be heard. She built a system to watch others, I said, but in the end, it was she who was being watched. And in the end, Holmes said quietly, her design outlived the deceiver's. I looked at him. Did she know that she would not survive? Yes, he said. But she also knew that someone would follow the trail she left. We said our farewells to Inspector Braithwaite and to the constables, then stepped out into the sharp brightness of late morning. The carriage awaited at the gate, and as we settled into our seats, I found myself looking back just once. Through the upper window of the west wing, the light struck the portrait at an angle. For a fleeting moment I thought I saw the lens glint, the third eye, catching the sun like a final wink of revelation. As we rode away from Marchmont Hall, Holmes reached into his coat pocket and withdrew the final page of Lady Marchmont's diary. He handed it to me. Let it be known, not through vengeance, but understanding. I watched not to condemn, but to protect what little light remained. And if I fall before I can name the darkness, let my voice remain, hidden where only truth may find it. I folded the page and returned it to him. She was braver than most, I said. Holmes nodded, and his voice, when he spoke, was as quiet as I had ever heard it. She was not the first woman to be dismissed as hysterical, but perhaps now she will be the last one to be unheard. The journey back to Baker Street unfolded beneath a sky clearing at last, as if the house and its shadows had left their mark not only on us, but on the weather itself. Holmes sat in uncharacteristic stillness beside me, the final page of Lady Marchmont's diary folded neatly in his hand, though he had not looked at it again since placing it in his coat. I did not disturb him with questions, for I recognized in his silence the rare mood that came only when a case had struck at something deeper than logic or puzzle-solving, a chord of justice or grief or some private understanding Holmes rarely let surface. By the time we returned to our rooms, the familiar smells of tobacco and old books brought with them a grounding sense of place. The warmth of our hearth had never felt more needed. I removed my coat and sat, letting out a slow breath, watching as Holmes went to the desk and laid the diary beside the Morning Post, his fingers trailing across its cover. He did not speak for some time. Then, as if plucking a single thread from a tangled skein, he began, not in triumph nor in satisfaction, but in quiet reflection. She built her own case, he said, methodically, patiently. She believed in a system she could not trust, and yet left every means to convict the guilty, even those she feared she might wrongly accuse. I nodded. She may not have known the whole truth, but she prepared for it to be found. She recorded her thoughts as evidence. She left clues not for vengeance, but clarity. Most who sense betrayal turn to violence, to anger. She turned to documentation. I leaned forward. You always say data is key. She thought like you. She did, Holmes admitted, then added with a trace of something rare. It is not often I meet my match, even posthumously. We sat in silence again, interrupted only by the sound of the fire crackling. But even as the investigation had reached its legal conclusion, I could see that Holmes remained unsettled, not because the wrong person had been accused, nor even because the poisoner had almost escaped, but because the human intricacies of the crime had blurred the line between guilt and sympathy in ways even the most precise mind could not entirely chart. "Tell me," I said, after a pause, "do you think Fenwick truly meant to kill her?" Holmes took his time before answering. "Number, not at first. That is the tragedy. He began by controlling, not destroying. He believed he was helping her, easing her paranoia, creating calm. And when that calm frayed, when she resisted his unseen hands, he did not know how to stop. The poison became habitual, then necessary, and finally silent. He stepped to the mantel and lit his pipe, exhaling thoughtfully. Beatrice, too, was caught in it. Not innocent, no, but reacting. Opportunistic, yes, and frightened. She saw a chance to free herself from Lady Marchmont's dominance. But she lacked the vision to see how she was being used. Martha, poor soul, was a tool from beginning to end. And Henry? A scapegoat, a man of weak temperament and weaker will, but not a murderer. Holmes turned back to the desk, where the phonograph cylinder still rested in its case, the last voice of Lady Marchmont. He opened the lid and regarded it, not as one might, a mere object, but as if it were her portrait in miniature. "We speak often of the eyes watching from the frame," he said. "But in truth, it was the voice that solved the mystery, not mine, hers. Do you intend to send the evidence to Scotland Yard? Of course, Inspector Braithwaite has the journals, but this—" He tapped the cylinder. "This I shall keep for now. It belongs to no court. It is her voice, and she deserves to be remembered beyond the poison and the suspicion." I stood, moved by the depth of feeling beneath his words. "You've solved many cases," I said, "but few that began as a whisper and ended in something so deeply human." Holmes looked toward the window, where the fog was finally lifting over Baker Street, and said nothing. Over the following week, news of the case filtered out across London. The broadsheets carried headlines that focused more on the inheritance scandal than the truth behind the poison. "Heiress arrested in shocking haul." Scandal read one. "Lady Marchmont's death re-examined." "Servant also implicated" read another. There was no mention of the surveillance chamber, no reference to the painting's hidden eye, and certainly no tribute to the woman who had foreseen her own fate and left behind a trail so cunningly designed that even Scotland Yard could barely keep pace. Holmes, for his part, avoided the newspapers entirely. He refused to be interviewed, rejected every invitation to speak with the press, and, when offered commendation by the constabulary, replied only with a curt, "Justice, not praise, Inspector." One evening, as I was finishing up my notes on the case, intended perhaps for future publication, Holmes stood at the window once more. He was not a man given to nostalgia, but I saw in his stance something close to melancholy. "There's a curious thing about justice, Watson," he said, not turning. "It rarely matches the form we expect of it. Often it arrives as revelation, not punishment. Do you think she knew it would be enough?" He finally looked at me, his face grave and thoughtful. "I think she hoped that one person, just one, would believe her, that someone would listen not to the noise of gossip or appearances, but to what she left behind. She made herself a witness, and in doing so she ensured her death would never go unanswered." He moved to the fire and placed another log upon the grate. There will be more cases, Watson. There always are, but I do not expect to meet another like Lady Marchmont. I closed my notebook. Nor do I. We sat in companionable silence as the fire burned low. Outside, the city carried on, oblivious to the woman who had whispered her truth into shadows and the detective who had drawn it back into the light. And there, on our shelf, the wax cylinder remained, preserved beside the other relics of solved cases. But this one did not represent conquest. It represented testimony, not of crime, but of dignity. And so the eyes that once watched from the frame would watch no more, for they had been heard. It was some weeks later, on a grey November morning, that the final letter arrived. Holmes and I were seated at breakfast, the coal fire barely keeping the damp from creeping in through the window panes. The letter bore the seal of the Hertfordshire Constabulary and was addressed in the neat hand of Inspector Braithwaite. Holmes opened it without comment, scanned the contents and passed it silently to me. Mr. Holmes, the magistrate has concluded his hearing in the matter of Lady Evangeline Marchmont's death. Basil Fenwick has been formally charged with manslaughter, and further charges of criminal conspiracy and concealment will follow. Miss Beatrice Marchmont has been released under caution, her involvement deemed opportunistic but not fatal. Martha Stowe has pled guilty to accessory charges and will likely serve a reduced sentence given her cooperation. Your findings were instrumental in securing the truth. I have no doubt that without them, justice, however imperfect, would have failed to arrive at all. Respectfully, Inspector Charles Braithwaite, I folded the letter, considering its implications. Holmes was buttering a slice of toast with mechanical precision. So, I said, that is that. Holmes nodded. As close to resolution as this world allows. You're not satisfied. He glanced at me. I am not dissatisfied, Watson, but it is a conclusion built upon tragedy rather than triumph. There are no villains here in the operatic sense, only people, frightened, selfish, confused, acting under pressure they could not endure. I nodded slowly. But the truth was still uncovered. Holmes leaned back in his chair and studied the ceiling for a long moment. Yes, he said at last, because Lady Marchmont designed for it to be. He stood and moved toward the shelf where we kept our case relics. The wax cylinder still sat in its velvet-lined box, untouched since our return. He opened the lid and regarded it for a moment, then closed it gently. She understood, Watson, what few ever do. That truth is not always heard when spoken aloud, but it can be preserved, awaiting someone willing to listen. And she counted on you. Number one, anyone capable of reading the signs. I was merely the one who followed the trail best. A more poetic man might say she chose me, but I say only that she left no room for failure. I saw something shift in him then, something rare. A flicker of empathy. A quiet acknowledgement not of his own brilliance, but of the woman who had required it. She never got her justice in life, I said. No, Holmes replied, but she shaped its path in death. That evening, Holmes did something I had not seen him do in all our years together. He returned to the phonograph. He placed the cylinder on the spindle, wound the crank carefully, and let the machine come to life. Lady Marchmont's voice emerged, steady and composed. If you are hearing this, it means the silence has ended. I was not believed in life. Perhaps I will be in death. I do not want punishment. I want understanding. I want someone to see what I saw, to know that I watched not out of paranoia, but out of love for what this house once was. Holmes sat with his eyes closed, listening until the last word faded and the needle scratched against silence. Then he rose, removed the cylinder, and placed it in a small tin marked simply, "The Marchmont Testimony." No more was said that night, and perhaps no more needed to be. Some cases end with applause, some with scandal. But the case of the eyes watching from the frame ended with a voice, clear, resolute, and finally heard. And in that Holmes saw something greater than the satisfaction of deduction. He saw the reason he listened at all.